So, good afternoon, everyone. I decided to spare you from an introduction on building inclusive cities and adaptive cities because they often stay at the theoretical level. And we have here today the pleasure of having a panel of seasoned, experienced, lived professionals. And it's better that they tell you from themselves and the experience they have accumulated over years, how is it to build inclusive and adaptive cities, and what are the pathways and the solutions. I have from left to, yes, exactly, so my other left. So from my far right to my closest right, I'm gonna just say their names and for you to have a sense of where they come from, but I will ask them to also introduce themselves and to take the time to give you a sense of who they are and what they do themselves. But then I have Sonam Choden, and Sonam is joining us from Bhutan. And Sonam will share her research and journey leading ReBuiltBhutan. So that's Sonam over here. And then Shipra, Narang Suri. Shipra, I've tried, I've tested it, but that's how it landed. Shipra is based in Nairobi, and Shipra is a senior policy advisor at the UN Habitat. And then she will share with you, with the vast experience she has advising leaders and at the national and local level, she'll share with you a few of these very important ideas and give you some example across the world. And then I wanted to say Sheela Patel doesn't require introduction, but we will introduce you nonetheless. And Sheela has been at the forefront of bringing communities in places where decisions are made for many, many, many years. I remember I heard her name, I'm not gonna say how long that was.
It's okay.
Yeah, yes, but she's always been very vocal about really bringing communities and communities in informal settlements where decisions are made and for them to take the agency to build, to take the decision that they need to have a better life. So, and I don't promise you that this panel is gonna be very quiet. I don't promise you that there won't be any controversial statement, because we are here to speak about inclusivity, but there's not a lot of representation of ourselves here, right? So we're gonna get into it, and we're gonna address a little bit the elephant in the room as well, if that's okay with you, all right? So I'm Nathalie Jean-Baptiste. I am, you heard it, the head of program of the Julius Baer Foundation. I'm a trained architect, but then I worked 18 years in research and in development in different parts of the world. Before coming and taking the position in Switzerland, I was in Tanzania, and I transitioned into philanthropy by, randomly, and it's been a really wonderful journey. And my work is about addressing inequalities, and we will also talk a little bit about that at some point in the panel. But what I want right now is to just simply allow our wonderful panelists to tell you who they are and where they come from, what work do they do, and also perhaps what motivates them to do what they do. So Nan?
Why don't you start? Young people start first.
So Nan, go ahead. We agreed, Sonam, that we will follow my lead, so let's just go. Yeah, go with the flow, all right?
All right, so usually in our custom, we let the eldest one speak. So yes, that's why I was giving the opportunity to Madam, but if you want me to, so I'll. So I'm Sonam Choden. I'm from Bhutan. I live in Bhutan and work in the South Asian subcontinent. So my work doesn't just limit in Bhutan, but I've worked a bit in Nepal and in India as well, and a bit in Bangladesh. So Just before coming here, I was in the northeast India trying to meet the tribal communities, looking at value chains, nature-based materials. But over the past 2 decades, I'm a trained forester, but my work and the challenges and the sort of the projects that I've been working led me into different fields. So I was majorly doing work on wetland ecosystems, watershed management, water resources management, food security. And then finally, while building the watershed management plan for the capital city of Bhutan, somehow I saw that there was a gap between the green sector and the brown sector, and I started working more with the infrastructure ministry. And of course, there are a lot of challenges. Bhutan is not an Eden, but of course, it is also very special. Bhutan is a very unique country within the subcontinent. We are sandwiched between 2 giants, and we try to keep our identity or preserve our identity. So I'm sure most of you all know about Bhutan and its uniqueness. However, there are challenges, and I'm sure you also must have heard about GNH, Gross National Happiness. That's the development philosophy that we've been following since the 1970s. That was when the 4th king sort of guided us with this vision of Bhutan, where we need to protect our environment. And I think Bhutan is the only country in the world that has in its constitution that 60% of the country has to be forested, and all of us are a steward. So I think growing up, that kind of motivated me, or it built an identity in me as well, to sort of be one of the builders of the country. I wouldn't say I've done a lot for the country, but I do know that within me, I do want to be part of the building process of the country and be one of the useful members, or be productive in my own sense. With that, I hand it over to Madam.
Yes, go ahead, Shipra.
Thanks very much, Sonam. So I work with UN Habitat. I've worked in the area of sustainable urbanization, cities for about 3 decades. I'm a trained urban planner from India with a PhD in politics from the University of York in the UK. And most of my career has been in some way or form with the UN system, mostly with UN Habitat, but also with other UN agencies trying to advance agendas related to sustainable development, sustainable cities and communities, inclusive cities. Until last year, I was managing a portfolio of projects around housing, slum upgrading, basic services, national urban policies, climate, etc., in about 55 countries around the world. And now I work on a little bit more zoomed out worldview, strategic policy advisory to our executive leadership. What keeps me awake and what makes me come to work, both things in the morning, is really, the big questions around cities that we talked a little bit yesterday. Same alluded to them, and others in the panels. The fact that we are nearly 60% urban, but the fact that 2.8 billion people in the world live in some kind of housing inadequacy, whether they're living in slums and informal settlements, or overcrowded housing, or in homelessness. 1.5 billion people don't have access to water and sanitation. 100 million people are displaced due to conflicts. By 2050, we'll have 200-something million people internally displaced due to conflict or climate change. These are big numbers, and I don't know if we are doing enough at this point in time to be able to change that reality, both for today and for tomorrow. So I think that's really where I come from, and that's really what we work collectively towards at UN Habitat. Happy to share some of those experiences and challenges with you later in the conversation.
Thank you very much, Shipra.
Do you know all of our names start with S? We are the S Brigade.
working on slums.
Yep, there you go.
So I'm doing this work for 50 years now. And the reason I'm saying that is I am in deep despair that nothing has changed politically, financially, educationally for the lives of those who have the courage to come into cities to survive. One of the most amazing transformation I went through when I started work was to look at the amazing courage and fortitude of women who followed their husbands with their children into cities simply because in most cases they didn't get to eat 2 full meals a day in their village. And many of them in India that I know of would be sexually abused by their relative men in the absence of their husbands. So that's the history of my initiation into working with women who lived on the pavements of the streets of Mumbai. And through a series of amazing accidental explorations, we began to develop almost a right of poor people to produce evidence-based representation because they were invisible. I love to hate planners because our Indian planners are being taught by colonial planning instruments. Nobody acknowledges that 60 to 40% of people who live in cities live informally. They are not mapped. Their areas are shown as no development zones. And therefore, this aberration of invisibility of those who serve all of us who live in the city one way or the other remains the most horrific situation. And the way in which we transformed this process was by forming associations and networks of people, of communities based on whose land they squatted on. And we took the evidence and we harassed bureaucrats, we harassed private sector owners to say, you cannot ignore these people. And of course, there are lots of stories that I can go on. But the point I want to make is that today we are faced with a double jeopardy because now it's not just about the development deficit, it's now related to climate. And climate is going to exacerbate the number of people who come into cities as water, extreme heat, and all these things are going to decimate. We've seen what Kirsten did. She showed us a nightmarish situation of what's going to happen with food. And so we're now looking at ways by which we can, as a global network of people who are invisible, begin to demonstrate what people are doing themselves and look at ways by which we form alliances, formal and informal, to produce solutions for them. Because in the climate space, when you talk, today I've been auditing when you talk about cities, who talks about informality? There's nothing. It's those poor people living somewhere. So that's what I do, and that's what I'll talk about if you give me more time.
You will have enough time. Let me go to you. Ah, you have that already. Then perhaps this for you. So you have a sense of where the panelists come from, but I want to now get a little bit more deeper into what Sheela just mentioned about the fact that now not only you have to address questions of development, questions of having access to basic needs for a large portion of the population, but you do have to now add to the equation the climate issue. And building resiliency and building cities that can adapt to the changes. It's even more important in this context, but there's a lot of other hurdles. And I'd like to hear from you, Shipra, first, because you have an overview, because you have also contributed your expertise to a number of different cases in different parts of the world. Tell us from the perspective of the UN Habitat, what have you done in this space?
So I think let's start with the hurdles, and I'll convert those into sort of 3 clear pathways that we've learned in our work on working with cities to build resilience, to build inclusion, to enhance development. And I want to put a disclaimer here right up front that one of the pain points I have is that we're trying to put things into boxes when they don't belong in boxes. And Sheela and we have had this conversation many times. Development is not the same as adaptation. Money that goes to development and infrastructure is different from money that goes to adaptation and resilience, which is nonsense because people live their life. People don't live their lives in these artificial boxes and nomenclatures that we create, and the double jeopardy or the triple jeopardy that people are facing, conflict, climate, and development deficits often comes together in the cities of the global south where we work. I think the first thing I'd like to start with is where Sheela and I always have this argument about what is the role of planners and planning in these processes, and what type of planning and whose planning are we talking about. And UN Habitat over the past 10 years has really tried, and I keep saying tried because nothing is an absolute success in the environment in which we work. We have really tried to build an inclusive, participatory visioning and planning processes that go beyond, typical colonial top-down master planning, in which a large part of the city and its residents are invisible. We've also tried to make sure that planning for resilience and planning for development and planning for adaptation are not different things, because that's also what happens. Cities get grants and support from different actors who say, you build a resilience plan now, and now you build a spatial plan, and now you build another type of plan and develop another type of plan. So as an example on that, I think we did some interesting work in Tajikistan, a place called Khorog, which is like this, 2,200 meters above sea level, a small town, a town very vulnerable to multitude of hazards of earthquakes and landslides and flooding. And we went there to do an integrated spatial planning process for them, again, with some assumptions and data. And then one of the biggest questions that came out in the participatory processes was actually that people had no secure tenure. That they came back to the question of, we can't invest in our houses, in our homes, in resilience, because actually the biggest question here is security of tenure. And that was interesting. We didn't expect it in a place in Central Asia. I expect it in India and I expect it in Brazil, but I don't expect it in a place in Central Asia. So that changed the entire narrative around what that plan was going to focus on. A second thing that we talk about, which is another important pathway, is really infrastructure, adaptive infrastructure that needs to be transformative. We heard yesterday about green-blue networks, about drainage, about public parks, about sponge cities, about all infrastructure that we create in cities must be adaptive and must be resilient and transformative in that way. And we just had a great discussion on this table, which talked about, adaptation is not sexy, but you have to show that adaptation infrastructure is not only working for the tomorrow, but it's working for the here and now. The public spaces we design, the green spaces we design, where do we put them? What do we do with them? So, we've done a lot of work in that space. But we're also learning that nature-based solutions are great. They can hit, we talk about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals all the time. They can hit 120 of the 169 SDG targets, but only 0.3% of any investment in infrastructure. It's actually going towards nature-based solutions. So, I mean, you know, where do you even start having these conversations about transformative and adaptive infrastructure? And my final point in terms of pathways for resilient cities, inclusive cities, adaptive cities, is really about scaling up solutions through multi-level governance. And, you know, much as I think communities have taken matters into their own hands because governments have failed them and failed them repeatedly, right? But at the same time, to be able to scale up solutions, you need the policy ecosystem to be fully engaged. You need local governments to be fully engaged. You need regional governments, state governments where they exist to be fully engaged. And you need national governments to set the right policy frameworks, you know, to be able to take solutions to scale. Whether it is solutions around housing, or it is solutions around infrastructure, or it is around new materials. We had this conversation. Building bylaws don't permit you to use good, you know, sustainable materials in many countries. So how do you get into transformation if there are policy barriers, regulatory barriers, systemic barriers that don't allow you to embrace the solutions that communities are putting forward? And I think for us, that piece on multi-level governance and working with governments from top to bottom and bottom to top is really something that is absolutely fundamental. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Shipra. And I just want to go to you, Sonam. The question of the Bhutan, you've mentioned in your first statement that it's a different territory, right? And how do you then address the questions of building resilience in Bhutan? And can you give us a little bit more, you know, information about the work you did? And is it sustainable over time?
Okay, that's a lot of questions, but I'll try to address, and if I miss out, do remind me. So see, Bhutan is a small country. It's a country that has, you know, it's a small population. It's like Switzerland, very mountainous, and we have fast-flowing rivers. And during the monsoon season, just last year, the capital city of Thimphu, the north of Thimphu, had a big cloud burst, and it was a flood event that I didn't see in my lifetime, and it happened just, you know, in this city, the north of the city, and that place was locked down, like everything was washed away. So in terms of infrastructure, I think Bhutan still struggles with a lot of sustainable infrastructural issues. I think the problem is very complex. I remember, I mean, I don't know, maybe this might be controversial, but I remember when I was working on an ecosystem-based management project, infrastructure. I won't name the specific agency, but it was a UN agency. And the consultant was proposing draining or building embankments on all the streams and rivers within the city limits. And then my question was, how is this ecosystem based? And I was working on the watershed management plan of that region. And then I noticed that when I talked with the communities, these streams, there were around 9 to 12 streams along the city limits, and all of them were drained. And some of them were like, because Bhutan is very culturally strong, we believe in the mountain deities, and you know, it's when you come to Bhutan, you'll know that there's a strong sense of this, and the culture is very strong, and there are these springs along the streams that were also gone. And basically, it's complex in a way because there are the people who are originally from that area is now, you know, there's a lot of rural-urban migration, so there's a lot of people from other regions, not necessarily from out of the country, but Bhutan is very diverse. There are many languages, because it's like an ox tribe. It's, you know, there are lots of valleys, and there are different languages, different cultures. So what happened is the people who had immigrated into the city, they kind of don't know the cultural context. But if they know, they'll probably be more conscious about it, right? So most of these streams and springs were also disappearing. And so these are the struggles that we have. And that's also because, of course, we are not, a developed country. We just graduated from the underdevelopment status. So we still have, our economy is not so strong. We struggle with that. So the financial crunch is also there. So now in terms of infrastructure, that's the situation. But in terms of the social structure, Bhutan is quite strong. It's sort of part and parcel of us, If we see our neighbor going hungry, we wouldn't let our neighbor be hungry. It's a very strong social system. And what's happening right now is also the king has, because we see a lot of youth unemployment, and the majority of the population is, young folks. And what we started doing, it was the king's vision to create this. If you come to Bhutan, you'll see this orange jacket youths. They're all trained as, they're volunteers basically. They're known as the guardians of the peace. So they basically volunteer in all aspects of development. So if there's a disaster, they are there. So what happened was going back to that flooding event, because my story is going to go in loops, okay? So going back to the flooding event, what happened was immediately on the site, the fourth king has already retired. He retired, he handed over the country to his son, and then Bhutan became also paved the path for the constitutional democratic monarch, so it's a democracy now. So what happened was we saw our fourth king also on the site, trying to be there to help the people. So when there is this kind of visionary leaders, benevolent leaders, there's also this metal. I think the metal in Bhutanese people are very strong because we've never been colonized. There's a very strong identity, and we all want to be part of the development of the country, or the country to become stronger. So I think that's how we have survived, and that's sort of the social structure. So this is sort of the situation. So in terms of, I think, economic stability, we have a problem. In terms of infrastructures, we have a problem. But in terms of social, we're quite strong in that. And now with coming back to my current sort of work, we see this infrastructures in Bhutan that are very, because we're very close to India, the labor, we have to bring the labor from India. So the materials that they work with, of course, we've also been bombarded with bricks and cement, right? So in the traditional way of building, we use nature-based materials. And that sort of skill and information is also disappearing in the country. Initially, I was sharing this story yesterday to somebody that the carpenter, the chief carpenter or the architect in Bhutan, usually in a traditional homestead, when the house is completed, the architect also sits on the chair with the owner. When we go for the, sort of celebration, completion of the house, the architect also gets the gift. He also has to be paid equally, gifted equally as the owner. So there's that kind of respect, and there's the skill was there. Bhutanese are very good in wood carving and masonry, stonework, all of this, but these are slowly disappearing. And now you see a lot of cements and a lot of bricks, and my work is basically to look into what are the value chains, what are the nature-based materials that we can bring in as a say, engineered bamboo, mass timber, all of that, to sort of bring it in the building code, as well as to incorporate it so that the architects, the constructors, the builders, the homeowners can avail and use these materials into building more resilient homes, and building a regenerative city. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonam. We're going to get more to that because I'd like to know what are the examples of the nature-based material that you want to incorporate. We'll get a moment to that. But you said something really interesting, which is benevolent leadership. And I want to get to you with that keyword. Because if you would want to build an inclusive and adaptive city, you would, in theory, would need to have benevolent and transformational leadership across the board to make sure that the marginal community are not left behind. What has been your experience over the years, Sheela?
Poor people help everybody, and then everybody forgets them. That is the situation. All of you during COVID, if you remember, our lives functioned because there was somebody who was transporting vegetables, food, infrastructure for us, whether you were in the north or the south. Everybody valorized it for about a week or two, and then we forgot about it. For me, that is forgetful benevolence. And I think we need to be very honest about these things. As citizens in the global south, when Shipra lived in India or I lived anywhere, or anybody who comes from the south, as women, we cannot do anything if we didn't have the support structure of people who look after our families directly and indirectly. And yet, we want them to be invisible. So that's my answer to your benevolent story. Where disasters are concerned, in India, whenever there have been floods, wherever there have been fires, you know, we had, just like there was 9/11, we had in Mumbai, we had bomb blasts everywhere. Who came out to help people? Not people like you and me. There were people who came out of slums who carried dead bodies, carried victims, carried children away from the fire and from the burning trains and things like that. So in the times of crisis, the generosity is that of those informal communities because they are there and they come and help. So that's there. But can I talk about something else?
I knew you would anyway. So you're very kind in asking, but go ahead.
So what I want to say is that I want to transform your discussion on benevolence to the power of representation and aggregation. So one of the biggest gifts that I have received is the amazing ability of poor neighborhoods to be organized around issues that matter for them. And the contribution of the professionals like myself who are in these various processes, we were able to produce solid data of volumes and volumes of people that the city could never produce. And that challenged the data that universities and government officials produced, that through contestation allowed us to the point that, you know, in India, our censuses are very famous. So it is with our network that the census office does the survey of people who are homeless, who live in slums, who live in difficult places. And that comes out of the fact that the best data on poverty is collected by communities themselves. And this is something that we have done not only in India, we have done this not only in India, but through a network called the Slum Dwellers International. We have done this in 17 countries in Asia and Africa and Latin America. And that is the basis of the dialogue and negotiations that these communities have with their state and their cities. Most of the time, it doesn't produce a housing stock, but it sometimes stops evictions. It sometimes helps them get water and sanitation. Sometimes we work with, very Same. We now work with, so when our government comes in any of our countries and gets loans from the World Bank, it's often the slum dwellers that actually produce the solutions and the delivery. because our engineers and architects don't know how to produce toilets and drains and stuff like that in dense, informal settlements. So I'm just saying that there is this amazing capacity to do these things, and yet the institutional arrangement of legality almost ensures that there is no movement in this process. And that brings me to, many of you are researchers, right? And work with philanthropies. We are fed up of people who design solutions in the global north and shove them down our throats. And then come and evaluate us. Some other person comes to evaluate you, and everything you do is wrong because you followed a methodology that you didn't want to do, but because somebody gave you the money, you did it. And one of the most amazing changes that we are able to do is we are able to tell people who give money to say, don't give it for this. Use this methodology which we have proved, and let us demonstrate what we can do. So we become partners and not your subjects of extraction, where you take the data, you go to some prestigious university, and you produce a hypothesis, and then you ask your government to give money to something which then doesn't work.
Yes.
So I'm just stopping there.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I think these are important things. You guys are all important decision makers, and it's important to transform your relationship with communities to that of partners. Because now when we are talking about development and climate, we don't have time to play these games.
Yeah. Thank you for this, Sheela. It's clear, and I actually also want to ask you all to contribute if you have also questions, doubts, or something specific you want to add. We're going to open also the floor to you a little bit later. But I want to go back to the question of, we have the type of data that the community that you serve produces. We know that we need to speak to and with a number of different stakeholders to ensure inclusive solutions. And we know also that we have to address new types of challenges in the likes of Bhutan that you have mentioned. I want to go back to you, Shipra, and for you to tell us, okay, in your experience, specifically, do you have an example of what has worked? And an example perhaps of you've learned and you would then avoid?
Okay, so I wanna start where you stopped, Sheela. In Mozambique, we did a program on in a small town called Chokwe, but also all over Mozambique. We worked in Mozambique for a long time. It's one of the most climate vulnerable countries in Africa and potentially also in the world. It's also it faces a cocktail of development deficit and climate and conflict and political polarization and the colonization, which has never really gone away. So I think there is it's really an extremely important place for us to work as the UN. And we worked in a number of municipalities. We worked in a small city called Chokwe, and there not just data, but the entire set of, the entire mapping of risk was done by the community with Habitat and with other partners. The entire development of resilience solutions and options was done with the community. And ultimately, that was brought in and integrated with the local municipal development plan with the local government. And eventually, that went up to be sort of transformed and integrated into the national sort of urban climate resilience strategy. So that was a really interesting example. The other interesting example also in Mozambique was when we had a safe schools program, and I think that was in partly also funded by the World Bank or fully funded by the World Bank, and Habitat started supporting communities to look at safe schools, building schools that were resilient to disasters. And ultimately, because the communities had guided us and supported us and worked with us, the prototypes of those schools that were created ultimately, when two horrific cyclones struck back to back, some of those were the only schools standing. And the result of that was that eventually that standard was integrated into the building standards and the building code, saying no schools to be constructed in Mozambique without this level of standard. The World Bank came in and others to say, we're not going to fund anything which is not constructed to this standard. So I think transformation is possible, but two things are needed. One is a deep, deep, deep faith in building it from the bottom up. And second, a long-term commitment to the communities you're working with. You cannot go in and go out, because that neither builds the trust nor the confidence nor sees long-term solutions. So I think for me, those are the two lessons that we've learned.
Thank you, Shipra. So you heard it. Transformation is possible in your context. And you've mentioned before that your work is about including natural-based materials into whatever intervention that needs to happen in terms of building the infrastructure that Bhutan needs. Can you give us a specific example of what has perhaps worked?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say it has worked. We're still working on it. So the current sort of work that we're trying to do is we're trying to transition into a regenerative built environment. So now to do that, it's complex. There are different levels. The policies have to change. The materials have to be available. The designers need to sort of absorb those materials within their designs. And there has to be a willingness also from the demand side to use these kind of materials and appreciate it. I think in our research, what we've found out is there's a very high sort of acceptance and a there's an affinity towards nature-based materials. The architects, even the builders, the contractors, everybody wants to use these materials, but it's not available in the market. The value chain doesn't exist. And on top of that, when you have cheaper materials from China and India, the nature-based materials, the cost increases. So then, you sort of try to balance this out, and usually, or, every businessman would want to sort of, I wouldn't say compromise on the quality, but try not to compromise on the quality, but at the same time, make the maximum profit, right? So everybody wants to make money out of it. So what's happening is this is sort of the challenges that we face, and then now we're looking at, okay, if we could look at policies that could support, if they use nature-based materials, what sort of incentives that could be provided from the policy sector. So we're also moving with, working with the ministry, working with the different actors, and also looking at new technologies. So we're looking at hemp, as in hempcrete. So we have a lot of hemp in the country, right? It's considered, illegal, so you just burn it or cut it down. But why not use it? And if you look at the historical context of hemp, it was grown, it was used in the past. But because of the, addictive and the drug content of it, it sort of became very unpopular, and that's how it. So then we look at bamboo, and if you look at bamboo in the West where bamboo is not grown, it's considered like a precious item and a very sexy building material. I'm using this word because I kept hearing sexy in the previous discussion. So it's a sexy material, right? Even in my university, the entire sort of building was, when I was in school, was made of bamboo, and it was a very nice, chic, a place to be at. Now, if you look at the marginalized communities, right, bamboo is a poor man's material. So even in Bhutan, if you during those days, if you see a thatched bamboo house, we could easily know that, oh, that's a temporary house, or not necessarily a poor house, but a temporary house. And then, of course, there are also poor people who live in these sheds, because these are easily extractable, and you can, you can do wattle and daub method, you can build houses. So even like our architecture has like different, the traditional, the conventional architecture, there are different ways of using the bamboo, but it's not necessarily considered like a very durable material. Now what we are looking at is transforming that bamboo into a much more acceptable material, like an engineered bamboo that could be part of, build the value chain, be part of the building code, and be able to use. So we're not looking at transforming an entire building into a nature-based, a regenerative building. We are trying to also, try to use the low-hanging fruits, because the built environment is one of the highest, right? 40% of the carbon emission comes from the built environment. Until now, I was focusing on forests and nature, and then I see that actually you can do so much in nature, and the policies are strong. We've been doing conservation, but whatever we are doing is, it's sort of not compensated by the built environments. So what we are trying to do is we're trying to change some of the components of the building. Like say, if we use the flooring material as bamboo, then you're replacing it with, cement and tiles and all. So let me just finish 2 points, and then, then I can shut up. So then we're also looking at mass timber. Bhutan has a lot of trees, and the conservation policy is so strong that now there is a parliamentary debate actually going on right now. Just before I came here, there was a lot of discussion about how we utilize the forest, how we harvest it, and how we use the timber. Of course, we've also started to pilot mass timber houses, and of course, Switzerland has been one of our partners. So we've built several mass timber houses, and if you've heard about Gelufu Mindfulness City, I will come to that later on. But there as well, we're using mass timber to construct the new airport that is already being launched. I'll leave it here right now.
Yes, please, because I have hands. And Sonam, you need to know that we are between them and lunch, So it's a complicated thing. So we need to kind of make sure that we get also some feedback from them. So I see a few hands. So let's go. Madame.
Thank you, Nathalie. Thank you, panel. My question is for you, Sheela, on the last point you made, where you say we have to transform the relationships to that of partners. And we are in a community here, I think we're dominantly global north. For me, it would be very interesting to learn from you what such a partnership looks like, and perhaps also if you see those examples.
Yeah, thank you. Well, a big thank you to Sonam, because as one of the people with the nature and biodiversity kind of hat on, here, don't want to be labelled, but certainly in that space at the moment, I was really glad you brought in a term I'll introduce into the conversation that we haven't actually heard yet, which is the bioeconomy. And there's a north-south dimension, since we're talking about inclusiveness and bringing in the north and south communication. So in Nature Finance, the other organisation I work with, we worked very hard last year with the Brazilian presidency of the G20, which I know is not all of the global south, but it's got India, it's got Brazil, it's got South Africa, many big global south players, to develop some high-level principles on the bioeconomy. And those were adopted by the whole of the G20 last year. There's only 9 of them. I just want to read you one, because I think it really picks up many of these points. Number 7. Benefit from robust and coherent policy frameworks. What you were saying, Sonam, you need that framework that foster trade for bioeconomy products and services, so into the construction sector, market conditions, sustainable business models, decent jobs, local value creation, and private sector and civil society participation. Look, it's only a set of high-level principles, they're not binding. I just wanted to say that there is a link. That little bit of connective tissue is quite interesting to me, at least, in this conversation, because we've been talking very much about, I didn't see the connection until we heard this conversation, so thank you.
There is a link, yes. Let's just go to you, and then after that, I'll ask Sheela to answer.
Also for Sonam, I thought it was so inspiring that you said Bhutan has a mandate to protect 60% of its forest or have 60% of its land forested. I can think of many countries in the world that have 60% of their land covered in forests, but you definitely don't see any of that reflected in their cities or built environment. So I'm curious from your perspective, especially as a forester, do you see that same kind of not only mandate but also cultural norm that I thought was fascinating that you shared reflected of protecting forests and trees reflected in cities and built environments, specifically in Bhutan? Thank you. Great panel.
Okay, Sheela, can you very quickly, because we have other.
So I think the whole idea is to produce partnerships in which the contribution that communities make is seen terrific, seminal, and unreplaceable. And we do that with large infrastructure projects. We do that with research. We have an example where we work very closely with Same. We do all the work on mapping infrastructure on the ground. They do it in the digital world. And they can't do what they do without what we do. And we can't do what we do without them. So that produces different relationships of trust. Because of the noise that all of us make in the COP process, in the non-state part of it, from last year, there is a whole stream of work on informality. And because I do a lot of screaming and shouting, I'm the ambassador for informality. So a lot of people have to come and talk to me because that protocol requires it. And that comes out of the fact that, that there is a contribution. There are systems that we do, and somewhere later on, if we have a chance, we're doing this amazing thing where we are looking at how poor people, who represent 92% of people who live informally in Asia, who are illegal, who design, construct, and finance their own homes. And we're looking at ways by which we develop way to do assessments that people can do. And we are actually, to the question of using biomass materials, we're working with hundreds of communities in rural areas who are working with agricultural waste to produce materials. And we're looking at ways by which they get money to start businesses. So there's a whole infrastructure that goes on, and it comes out of partnerships. And what we're doing is we're not, the other important thing is doing cute programs is not good enough anymore. So what we're doing is we're working with 100 neighborhoods in 20 countries, which we call our learning labs, where professionals, community people, people who do different types of materials work together to produce robust solutions that poor people can afford to do, and bringing that to governments to say, shame on you that you haven't invested in this. That's what they're coming in to do.
Thank you. Sonam, do you want to react to what?
I mean, if you want to take more questions, and we can discuss later, okay, but I can also answer.
You correct me if I'm wrong. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't heard once at this conference any challenge to the assumptions that the only imaginable future we have is urbanization in cities. I didn't hear any of the last conference I went to, or the last, or ever, in any conference ever. Is that ever opened up for discussion? And is that different in your world compared to, I mean, I'm from Australia. The north-south thing's complicated for us. We're north and we're south. But is that conversation something that's happening?
Should I start? I think the short answer is no, because no country has been able to stem the tide of urbanization. We are living in an urban world. People are moving more and more to cities, not just because of the pull factor of cities, but because of the push factor of where they live. Land is becoming unproductive. Opportunities are not there. Jobs are not there. Climate change, conflict, people are fleeing. Where do they go? They go to cities. We are 56% urban now, but we're expected to be 70% urban by 2050. So that's not that question is no longer on the table, whether we will be an urban world or a highly urbanized world, by 2050 or not. I think the question that is still on the table is how do you balance, how do you ensure that this urbanization balances the needs of people who are still living in rural areas as well. That urbanization works for everybody, whether they're moving to cities, or they're living in peri-urban areas, or they're living in highly vulnerable and precarious locations within cities, or they're living in rural areas and accessing cities due to markets and infrastructure and needs of different kinds. So I think it's really the question of what kind of urbanization are we looking at in the future? What patterns of urbanization, what territorial approaches are we looking at, rather than whether it's going to be a highly urban world or not?
Are we looking at that big picture, which the graph's been shown half a dozen times? There's the one world, there's the two worlds, the three worlds, the seven worlds. Are we looking at that picture about where the rural people are living in comparison to the urbanized world?
I think we are. I think we're consistently looking at that, and we're looking at also where they're moving from rural to rural, not just rural to urban. That whole picture about how climate and conflict particularly is affecting those movements. We are. Whether we are addressing that effectively is another question. But I think we're aware. But where are the strategies to address that? That's the real question, I think, in the mix.
Any other question in the room? Yes. No. Here.
Oh, fabulous. No shouting necessary. Shipra, I want to pick up, I want to put the forgetful benevolence in the point that you made, which is the fact that, the whole of governance piece still doesn't seem to be working. And I guess my question is a simple one. What kind of calamity, and we're seeing this, play out in the global majority and also in the global north, is it going to take for us to learn the fact that you cannot, unless you have a true multi-stakeholder decision power piece there. I mean, too often our cities have to be the decision takers. They have to be the implementing end of it all, but nobody in the national piece wants to hear a word from them. And Sheela's just said, look, shaming seems to work in some respects, but maybe that's not the only piece. And with your long perspective from the UN Habitat piece, what calamity is it going to take for people to learn that lesson, that those hierarchies are non-functional?
Well, the world is getting screwed, but I didn't say that. No, I think instead of calamity, I think what would it take and what does it take, first of all, is really exactly what we're talking about, organized communities. I think organized local government constituencies making their voices heard has been a very effective process. William is here. He's very much part of several of those constituency groups. Local governments coming together and talking about, we are not just, at the front line to implement national policy, but we're the ones that need to also shape national policy and international policy in some ways. So one is that, and that movement has been growing, let's say, over the past 2 decades and gaining momentum and getting heard, including at the UN and including in various national contexts. COVID helped in that respect. When COVID happened, again, national governments were at the front line, borders were closed, often just city borders were closed. And that was the time that national governments were also that local governments were setting policy as well. They were taking the measures to stop the spread of COVID. They weren't waiting just for national instructions. They were working with communities. They were setting their own sort of policy frameworks, and many of those, including pieces around housing. How do you move homeless people into vacant housing, into apartments? A lot of that was seen in Europe. A lot of those, how do you stop evictions at that point? You cannot let people go out into the street. A lot of that stayed post, the lockdowns being removed in the post-COVID period. So it showed that it can be done. And I think COVID was that turning point. A lot of governments, however, now we are almost 5 years after, have gone back, have regressed. And that, I think, is a factor not just of what we are hearing in this room, but the larger piece which Kirsten painted also in her presentation. That slide of that picture of J.D. Vance was very telling. But I think the point is that we are living in a world which is going backwards in so many ways rather than forward. And the last 5 years alone have done that.
All right, let me look around the room and see if there's any other questions. And maybe, Sonam, you can talk directly to Nadina. There's one question, okay, at the back that I was told that was the last question. But when we conclude, I'd like you to, those of you, stop drop your computer and your phone for a moment, and then think about sound bites. Perhaps something resonates with you. Think about it. You can say it out loud if you want, but we want to have maybe a collective sound of ideas that came out from this session. So, question very quickly and a quick answer.
I think we all were really inspired by Rob's presentation of having gone to the future and learning that we had won. Right next to me, I have a tote bag that says, I want to believe. I think a lot of us in this room have worked on a lot of these development issues for a long time. I know a lot of the people in the room from having worked on them and having collaborated and having seen them and reported on them. I would like to know what your main takeaway, and this is maybe to everyone on stage and everyone in general, what can we take away as how are we going to believe? What are we going to believe in? We are in a much darker place now than we were before. Make me believe.
Yeah, make me believe. So what are we going to believe in? Sonam, just a few words based on your context and your experience in the context of building adaptive city. What are we going to believe?
Well, I think belief is very strong, right? The hope to do something, hope to get things done. I think that's very important. I think personally over the past few years, I'd lost hope. I've lost hope in many of the things that I was doing. It was like you're always yapping, but nothing is getting done. You go to conferences, you go to meetings, you go to you meet people during the meet. It's like very powerful, but at the end, right after that, it's gone. It's fizzled out. So for me, I think slowly I'm getting back. I think there is, of course, leadership is important, and also the hope that things can get better. I think that's very important. And positivity, having that positive, understanding the situation or the challenges and bringing positivity into your life is also very important. So hope, I would say, is something that we need to keep nurturing.
Hope, positivity, believe that leadership important. Shipra?
I think it's a fundamental question, no? Make me believe that it's possible. I think what makes me believe is the power of local action. In the abdication by nation states and by national governments of their responsibilities, we're seeing more and more powerful action coming from the local level, local governments, as well as local communities. And that's what makes me believe that change is possible and change will be sustainable, because I think, we've stopped relying on national governments alone to do their job.
Be nice, Sheela.
No, I can tell you, if you go to most of the communities who live informally and you talk to women, they will make you believe. If I have the courage to say all these audacious things, it comes out of the belief that if I make space for them to have the choices that they want to make, they will transform their own lives. And the important thing is that the whole crisis of equity is what depresses all of us, because we don't see that in the environment in which we live, which is what Shipra was saying just now. But when you look at these women, and you look at the circumstances in which they live, you think they should be depressed and they should be really unhappy. And all they're doing is they are thirsty to know what to do. They want to transform their children's lives. They will and if you give them the power of aggregation, if you give them knowledge about the choices that they have to make, their energy levels are infectious. And for me, what I come here to do is to look at where are the 15 people that I can work with for doing that. And you don't have to sit next to me to do that. Now we have an ability to communicate. And you learn so many new things that you didn't know before. But the real fact, when you were talking about this, the other big challenge in the city space, and all of you who are professional, you need to do is to realize that the global north is pushing our elite to copy your lifestyle. Consumption patterns that you are trying to get away from are getting exponentially magnified since, if you look at any of our southern cities, I don't know how many of you have seen this Oxfam report that says anywhere at the world level, at a national level, at a community, at a city level, 15% own 75% of the resources of that area. Yes. Whether you are in Switzerland or you are in Mumbai or wherever. So when that happens, the aspiration of southern elite is to live the life. Everybody says, oh, like Switzerland. Oh, like this, oh, like that. And Mumbai's biggest bane is Singapore. We want to be Singapore. Singapore is no, not Shanghai, Singapore. Because Singapore is a city-state. And we have so many, I'm on so many of these committees where everybody is trying to, they come with their plans and they come with their planners and we look at them and say, what?
Let's
Luckily, it doesn't happen. But what I'm saying is that there is a lot of very positive energy. And I think those of us who overthink and want to change the world quickly are in despair. Because it won't happen quickly.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Yes, thank you for this round of applause for all our panelists. Thank you to you for taking the time to listen. I hope at least you have kept in your head some sound bites, some words that are important that you can, look back again and converse and talk to our panelists, and then, just continue the conversation in a way that we can find some positivity and belief. So thank you.